Hi, this is Nat, and this is your video lesson on calculating the mean for a set of data. We're going to talk about what the mean is, how we calculate it, and then we're also going to talk about how we look at the mean, median, and mode particularly, and decide what's typical for a set of data. First off, let's look at what the mean actually is. The mode and the median are a little easier to describe. When you talk about the mode, it's the most common. When you talk about the median, it's the middle number. A lot of people struggle with really describing what the mean actually is as an idea, beyond just the word or the way you calculate it. So let's take an example. Let's say the dots on this line plot represent a set of data. We have 5 here, then 3, then 4, and so on. There's lots of different numbers represented here, but one thing we could do is we could actually start reorganizing a little bit. All the numbers initially look very different, but let's say, for example, that we just take one of these blue dots here and we move it over here, or we take 2 of these green dots here and we take those and we move them to the purple column where there's only 2. And then we take this pink dot here and we move it over and put it on this yellow pile. What we can see here is that by redistributing these dots, instead of having a lot of columns that have different numbers of dots in them, now we have every column just has 5. So even though each of these columns started out with a different number of dots, I could say that what's normal for this set of data is to have, not 5, sorry I miscounted, but 4 dots. Because if I redistribute the dots, each column would have 4 and they'd all be equal. And that's really what the mean is. It's a way of saying what's normal or typical by equally distributing the data. Another way to understand this is to think of just throwing all the data into one big pot and then dividing it back out again equally, which is where the math for the mean comes from. As you've probably learned before, the mean is the sum of all the data divided by the actual number of data. When we're taking the sum of the data, what we're doing is we're basically just piling all that data up. We're collecting it in one big chunk. And when we divide by the number of data, what we're doing is passing it out again equally. So we're redistributing the data so that it's equal among all the original contributors. So as a quick example, if I have a data set 7, 8, 12, 15, 18, and I take the sum of all the data, that's 60, and I divide it by 5, the number of data, I end up with a mean of 12. So I could say that one way of describing what's normal for this set of data is to say 12 is normal, because that's what an even distribution of the data would be. That gets us back to this big idea of what is normal or what is typical for a set of data. When we talk about all the different statistics that we've covered so far, I like to think of them as different friends that you have. So we've got the mode, the median, the mean, the range, and some of us have talked about standard deviation. And like any good group of friends, they're all different. They're not exactly the same. They've got different things they're good at, different interests, and different reasons you should listen to any of one of them at any given point. The mode is like your friend who's only into what's popular and maybe watches like too much entertainment television or something like that and is constantly like drooling over stars and things. They're like, oh, what's popular? What's the best? It's focused entirely on keeping up with what's the most normal or what's the most common. And if you're asking what's typical for a set of data, it's just going to say what everybody else is doing. The median is a little more reasonable. It's all about striking a balance by figuring out what's in the middle and calling that normal or typical. It's never going to lead you totally astray because it's not doing anything crazy, but it's, also pretty formulaic. The mean is your friend who's trying to be, like, fair and balanced with everybody. It looks at and weighs all the information before it comes up with an opinion of what's normal or typical. The range isn't even worried about what's normal or typical, it's just busy thinking about how different everybody is. It spends its time thinking about, are we the same, are we not the same, how alike are we? And finally, you've got standard deviation. Standard deviation is all about trying to figure out who's totally off from everybody else and is completely unnormal. It cares a little bit about what normal is, but it's really there to point out the data that is totally off the wall. When it comes to deciding what actually is normal or typical for a set of data, you're really talking about these three right here at the beginning. The mean, median, and mode. So the question is, which of these do we listen to? Lots of students have a tendency to kind of go with the mode because they think about the mode as being the easiest to understand, and when you think about what's normal, you're like, well, it's whatever's popular, whatever the most common thing is. But that's actually a pretty shallow way of determining what normal is, and so honestly, the mode is like our dumb friend. We really don't care what they think, for the most part. There's a couple small scenarios where we might listen to them, but they're mostly like off in a corner being like, this is so popular. And you're like, whatever, read a book. So that leaves us with the median and the mean. These are our two most reliable friends, if you want to think about it that way. And generally speaking, the one we're going to listen to the absolute most is going to be the mean. We really like the mean because it takes all the data into account, and it really is fair. The one exception to that rule is when you have data that is an outlier, something that's really unusual, something you'd learn about from this guy over here. When you've got that really unusual data, the mean is almost too reasonable and too fair. It takes all that data into account and even this weird thing, so it weights things a little too heavily if you've got an outlier towards that outlier. So in that case, we go with the median. So most of the time we listen to the mean, but if for some reason we have a reason to think that it's being manipulated by an outlier, then we go with the median. And that's pretty much it. So here's some practice problems for you. For each of the data sets below, first calculate the mean, median, and mode for the data. Keep in mind, particularly for median and mode, you need to have the data in order to make it easier to calculate. Secondly, I want you to pick the one of those three, mean, median, or mode, that you think is normal. You can circle the one you think is the best representative of normal. All right, go for it. Oh, and by the way, please use a calculator. Don't do your mean calculations by hand. That would be a giant waste of your time. If you get a decimal answer for your means as well, you can round those to the nearest tenth or hundredth, whatever you'd like to do.